Everything was ready for another Sunday dinner. The table was set. My mother was smiling. My sister was arranging the cutlery. And my father, already seated at the head of the table as always. It was tradition. But that night carried a tension no one wanted to name. I felt it in the looks, in the silences between one sentence and the next. And, as always, I was the one who broke the mood. Unintentionally, I commented on the new project I was working on. A course I'd created for young people without access to university. I spoke enthusiastically, in detail, hoping, perhaps, for a little recognition. But my father slammed his fork down on the table. He looked me in the eye and said dryly, "Only those who are proud can sit here." The silence fell like a bomb. I froze. My mother tried to change the subject. My sister looked shocked, but no one said anything. And I stood up, my throat dry and my heart racing. I took a step back from my chair, and before turning away, took a deep breath and asked, "Are you sure about this?" He didn't answer. He just turned his face away. And that hurt more than any words. Share this story to reach further. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video on WhatsApp. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. As I walked to the door, my body trembled. Each step felt too heavy. I remembered all the times I'd swallowed frogs right there at that table. But now it was different. I was no longer the boy who asked permission to exist. I left the house without slamming the door, but with my heart screaming. And yet, I didn't expect what would happen 5 minutes later. I'd barely gotten into the car when my phone vibrated. It was my sister. The message had 3 words. "Come back here, now." My mind scrambled. I thought she was joking. But when I called, her voice was shaky. "Dad, you've gone blank. It's weird." I turned the key and was back in the car in seconds. That table where I'd been humiliated now felt like an emotional battlefield. When I walked in, I saw my father sitting, pale, staring into space. My mother beside me, unsure of what to do. The food was untouched. The same table, but a different atmosphere. I walked over and he looked at me as if for the first time. His eyes were teary. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Did you really do that?" I didn't understand. I asked what. He pointed to his phone on the table. I picked it up. It was a video, a local news report talking about the course I created, showing the young people, the testimonials, the difference it was making. My father watched it after I left, and there, without anyone asking, he saw it. He saw who I was trying to be. He saw what I never managed to convey with words in those short, judgmental conversations. He ran his hand over his face. "You did this all by yourself?" I just nodded. My chest tightened. For the first time, I saw my father silent, not out of anger, but because he didn't know what to say. It was as if the pride he so desperately demanded had been there all along, only in my own way, and he never wanted to see it. This wasn't about dinner anymore. It was about everything that had never been said between us. He didn't apologize, but he didn't tell me to leave again either. He remained silent. But this time, it was a different silence, not one of contempt. It was the silence of someone forced to see, who saw their son, and not just the shadow of the expectation they'd created. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes, the greatest answer comes when someone is simply speechless. That night, no one touched the food. The 3 of us sat there, my father, my mother, and I, with the TV playing softly and the video still paused on the screen. My father seemed distant, but not hostile. It was as if he were reliving his entire life before my eyes. When he finally spoke, it was hoarsely, "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" And I just took a deep breath, because I told him, several times, but he never wanted to listen. He wanted results that reflected his own. Success, money, positions. Not that kind of silent impact. I responded without aggression. I tried, but whenever I mentioned something that didn't fit your idea of success, you cut me off, and he fell silent again. But this time, listening. My mother held his hand. She said, "He never stopped, John. Even with all the pain, all the pressure, he built this with his own hands." My father swallowed hard, his eyes filled with tears, but he was too proud to cry in front of us. Still, something in him had broken. Something that would never be the same again. A wall, maybe. An expectation. The strangest thing was realizing that deep down, he was scared, as if his world had been rewritten without permission, because the son he'd seen as a failure was now a leader of something he'd never understood. And in that shock, He had to recalculate everything. What was right? What was success? What was, in fact, being proud of someone? Before bed, he called me aside. He said, "Wow, send me the link to that course." I didn't smile or thank him. I just sent it, because everything was in that request. It was him saying for the first time without shouting, "I want to know who you are." And for me, that was already more than I thought I'd ever get in my life. The next day, my father showed up at my building, a rare occurrence. He never came. He had a folder in his hand and tired eyes. He said he needed to talk. We went upstairs in silence. At my apartment, he sat down and took some old photos out of the folder. They were of him, young, sweaty, working on a construction site, with the hard look I knew well. And that's when he started talking. He talked about what he went through with his own father, a cold man who called him useless every day, who laughed at his dreams, who said, "You'll never amount to anything." And my father, at 17, ran away from home. He worked construction, swept floors, and went hungry. He swore that one day he would have children he would be proud of. He just forgot to ask them what pride meant to them. As he spoke, I saw another man, not the one who kicked me out of the table, but the boy who'd been kicked out of the house. And I realized he wasn't yelling at me. He was yelling at the echo of his father. And in his desperation to avoid repeating history, he ended up becoming exactly what he hated most. Because when you don't heal your wounds, you pass them on, as if they were an inheritance. I said it to him, slowly, carefully. "Dad, maybe you tried so hard not to be your father, that you forgot to be yourself." He lowered his head. He stood there, speechless. But this time, it wasn't pride. It was pain. Old, buried pain, tearing at me. And I didn't want to win an argument. I really wanted to reach out. And that's what I did. I placed my hand over his and said, "I'm still here, even after everything." And in that gesture, I understood that forgiveness is less about forgetting and more about seeing the other's pain, the other's fear, and deciding that, despite everything, you still choose to be there, not out of obligation, but because loving is also rescuing those who never knew how to be loved. The following week, I got a call that made me freeze. It was my dad, asking me to lunch. I'd never done that before. It was always my mom mediating everything. I asked, "Shall we have lunch just the two of us?" And he said, "Yes, just the two of us." That shook me. I knew he was trying, that maybe it was his way of saying, "I want to talk again." I arrived at the restaurant, and he was already there. Simple clothes, hands folded on the table, looking nervous. When he saw me, he stood up, and for the first time in years, called me by my full name, respectfully, firmly, but not coldly. That alone would have been enough. We sat down, and for several long seconds no one said anything, until he pulled an envelope from his pocket. Inside were some papers. They were sketches, ideas, drafts of a project. He wanted to create something together, a social arm within his company, focused on youth training. He said he'd seen my course, that he'd read the testimonials, that he'd cried watching a video, and then he realized he'd never built anything to give back, only to profit. That, it dismantled me. I remained silent, swallowing it all. That proposal wasn't about business. It was about connection. It was about pride, but not the arrogant pride that excludes. It was the silent pride that welcomes, that says, "I want to belong." I told him I needed to think about it, and he understood. For the first time, he didn't demand an answer. He just said, "I'm here, whenever you want." I left that lunch with a lump in my throat, because for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. I felt like I had to be who I was, and to allow him, in his own way, to be the same. Maybe broken, maybe behind, but willing. And sometimes, that's a stronger new beginning than 1,000 excuses. A few days later, I went to visit my mother. She was in the garden, working on her plants, as she always did when she needed to think. When she saw me, she didn't say anything. She just pointed to the chair next to me. I sat down. We were silent for a while until she blurted out, "He never cried for anyone, not even when his parents died." I knew who she was talking about. My father. She continued, "But yesterday after you left lunch, he locked himself in his room. I heard him. He was crying, softly, and he said, 'I almost lost my son.' It tore me apart inside, because my father never knew how to show anything. He always shielded himself with a steel armor, but now he was shattered inside, not from weakness, but from awakening." My mother took my hand. She said, "I know what he did to you. I saw it all, but I also know he's trying. And you, my son, are healing our family. My eyes welled up, because for years I'd felt like the burden, the problem, the disappointment. And now, I was seen as part of the healing. And there's no greater reward than that for someone who's always been the target of the pressure. She pulled a box out of the closet. Photos, letters, old things. One of them was my first letter to my father, when I was a child. It said, "Daddy, one day I will make you proud." And she read it out loud. Then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "You already have, son." It just took him a while to see it. That moment, I'll never forget it. I left there feeling full, not with victory, but with truth. Because healing didn't come from total acceptance. It came from listening, from trying, from surrendering. And most importantly, from the courage to return, not to be accepted, but to show that love is also a process of construction, even if it hurts, even if it takes time. 2 weeks later, my father invited me to a company event. He said he wanted me there, that it was important. I didn't understand why, but I went. I arrived and sat discreetly in the last row. He was on stage, giving a speech, dressed as always, dark suit, firm posture, serious tone. But that day, something in his gaze was different. Halfway through his speech, he paused. He took a deep breath. The audience fell silent. And then, without warning, he said my name. He spoke about me, about my journey, about his mistakes as a father. It took me a while to understand what pride is. I thought it was about achievements you see from afar, but it's about character, about integrity, and my son taught me that. The room fell silent. I froze. Some began to applaud. Others were moved. I could only breathe slowly, trying to take it all in. I never imagined I'd hear that from him. I never thought that man, so rigid, would one day call me a role model. In public, it was more than an acknowledgement. It was a reparation, a surrender, a declaration that even he didn't know how to make with hugs. After the event, he came up to me. He didn't hug me, but he put his hand on my shoulder. He looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I held back my emotions. I replied with a shaky voice, "Thank you for coming back." Because deep down, that was it. He had come back. To me, to himself, and to a kind of relationship we never had, but always deserved. That day was a turning point. Not just for him, but for me too. Because I stopped seeking approval, and I started accepting recognition as a consequence of consistency, of respect, of the path I didn't have to shout to prove. Sometimes all we need is persistence, even when others are slow to see it. After that speech, I started visiting my parents more often. Little by little, I began to see my father differently, quieter at times, but less harsh. He listened to me more attentively. He asked questions about the course, about the students. He even started sharing ideas. It was strange at first, as if I were meeting a new father, one who had always existed, but was trapped behind fear. One Saturday, I took some of my students to visit his company. It was a chance to share experiences, and my father made a point of welcoming them personally. He introduced each area, shared interesting facts, and made jokes. Yes, jokes. I saw the sparkle in those young men's eyes, but what struck me most was the sparkle in his own. He was a different man. At the end of the visit, he pulled one of the students aside, a boy who reminded me so much of myself 15 years ago, and he said, "Never believe your worth depends on what others recognize. Keep going, even when no one sees." That gave me chills, because he was talking to the boy, but looking at me. It was an apology in the form of advice. On the way home, that boy turned to me and said, "Your dad is amazing." I smiled and replied, "He's learning to be." Because the truth is, no one is born ready to be a father. And sometimes they make mistakes trying to get it right the only way they've ever learned, by toughening up. But when the toughness subsides, love finally appears, even if it's late. That day, I understood that my mission with him wasn't to confront or punish. It was to guide, to show that it was possible to relearn. And he, with all his limitations, was willing. Maybe he didn't know how to love the way I needed, but now he was learning. And that, for me, was worth more than any imposed pride. A few weeks later, we were in their backyard, just the two of us. The sky was cloudy, the smell of barbecue was in the air, and the atmosphere was calm. Out of nowhere, my dad turned to me and said, "You know I wasn't a good father, right?" That hit me like a punch, because he'd never said that before. He'd never admitted any wrongdoing. It took me a while to respond. I took a deep breath. I said, "You were the father you could be, but now you can choose to be someone else." He lowered his eyes. He stirred his glass, and after a few seconds he said, "I was afraid of raising fragile children, so I raised children in fear." And in that moment, I saw the man strip away his armor, words that carried more weight than shouts. He continued, "The world didn't forgive me, and I thought I needed to raise you to be immune, but too much immunity turns into isolation." I shivered, because it was real. It was the root of it all. He'd confused protection with distance, love with demand, and now I was understanding that, perhaps for the first time. We were silent for a while, the kind of silence that says it all. Then he stood up and said, "I want you to teach me. Show me how to build this kind of thing you do. I really want to learn." I held back my emotions and simply replied, "Then let's go together. Because the past doesn't matter. If there's a will, there's a path." In that backyard, amidst smoke and truths, we sealed a pact, unspoken, but felt, to walk side by side, to make room, to create a new story together. And in that moment, I understood. Reconciliation isn't about erasing what happened. It's about building something new, with the pieces that remain. Months later, we were at an investor meeting. It was the first time my father had taken me behind the scenes of his company. Before, I was the dreamy son. Now, I was the partner. He introduced me as the co-founder of a new social project the company was launching. And in that moment, he didn't just see me, he validated me, publicly. During the meeting, he asked my opinion, genuinely, not just out of politeness. And when I disagreed with a point, he listened, considered it, and relented. I saw the surprised looks on the other directors' faces. I saw respect blossoming there, at the table where I'd never had a voice before. And, most importantly, I saw my father accepting that leadership also means listening. On the way out, one of the executives pulled me aside and said, "You and your father are very different, but you complement each other." I laughed and replied, "It took us a while to figure that out," because it was true. We spent so much time fighting over our differences that we forgot they were the key. He, with experience, I, with social vision, together, finally adding up. In the car on the way home, he turned to me and said, "I used to see you as a stubborn boy. Now, I see you as a man, with ideas, with courage, and with something I never had, empathy." That broke me inside, because the greatest pain of my life was feeling like my father didn't see me, and now he was seeing, really seeing. And the most beautiful thing was realizing it wasn't about being right. It was about having presence, about being there, about sharing, about starting over every day, even with scars. Because in the end, the most beautiful story isn't the perfect one. It's the one that almost ended, but chose to continue. One ordinary morning, I received an unexpected message. It was my father. "Do you have time to talk? I need some advice." I froze. My father, the same one who called me a brat, now wanted my perspective. I said yes. He appeared in my office an hour later, an old notebook in hand and a sincere expression. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to speak. He'd received $1 million offer to sell part of the company, but something was bothering him. They want to cut off the social side of the business, what we built together. I know it would be money, but what if it's the price of my peace? For the first time, he wasn't just thinking about profit, he was thinking about purpose. I looked at him and said, "If you'd asked me this a year ago, I would have said yes right away." He laughed bitterly. I was blind, right? I shook my head. I was rigid. Now, you see. Then I added, "If this costs you what it took you a lifetime to understand, it's not worth it." He looked at me, took a moment, and then replied, "That's what I needed to hear." His decision was to stick with the project. He declined the offer, even though it was tempting. More than the decision, it was his attitude that made an impact, because it was no longer about proving anything. It was about being faithful to what we'd built. And there, in that gesture, I felt the cycle was turning. He was now also the guardian of something born from what he hadn't previously understood. We went out to lunch afterward. We didn't talk about it anymore. We talked about life, the little things. And that day, for the first time, I didn't feel like a son trying to be accepted. I felt like a partner, someone he could count on, trust, and share the weight of his choices with. It was light, and lightness, between us, has always been the greatest sign of healing. One rainy afternoon, I got a call from him. "Can you come over today? I want to show you something." I did. I found my father sitting in the armchair, a wooden box on his lap. I was rummaging through old things, and I found this. He opened the lid and handed me a folded photo. It was him, young, holding a baby. Me. I stared at that image for minutes. I'd never seen it before. He looked emotional. "It was taken the day you were born." I asked the nurse to take it. I asked why he'd never shown it to me. He replied, "Because every time I looked at it, I felt small, afraid of messing it up." His honesty broke me. He continued, "You were so little, and I already thought I was a failure. I thought being tough would make you strong, but I was too tough." He took the photo back, looked at it for a while, and then handed it back to me. "Now it's yours, because today I know that I wasn't wrong for not loving you. I was wrong for loving the wrong way." The tears came without warning, unstoppable. Not mine, not his. In that moment, there was no past. Just two men, sitting, trying to make amends after so many missed encounters. Time doesn't go back, but the truth has the power to heal where before there was only an open wound. And there, with that photo in my hand, I understood that what I sought most wasn't an apology. It was this, an acknowledgement of pain. I left with the photo in my pocket and peace in my heart, because now, even what wasn't lived had a place. Even what hurt made sense. My father wasn't a hero, neither was I. But there, amidst photos, failures, and reconciliation, we were just two men choosing to do things differently. And that, in itself, was a miracle. The day of the family reunion arrived, one of those big ones, with uncles, cousins, laughter, and too many dishes. I hadn't been in years. I always felt out of place, but this time my father insisted. He said, "I want to introduce you properly." I thought it was an exaggeration, but I went. Deep down, I wanted to see if he would be the same man in front of the others. And what I saw surprised me. In the middle of the meeting, someone mentioned something old. "Remember when your father told you to leave the table?" The question was lighthearted, but loaded with irony. The whole table laughed, except for my father. He raised his glass and said, "Yes, I remember, and I regret it, because if there's anyone here I'm proud of today, it's him." Silence fell. Then, applause. My mother cried softly. Some of my uncles looked confused. My cousin patted me on the shoulder, but I just breathed. It wasn't about show. It was about truth, about a father there, in front of everyone, recognizing the son he'd spent years trying to fit in. And now, he no longer fit, because he had grown, because he was finally seen, whole. Then my father pulled me aside. He said, "Today, you sit at this table as an equal, not because you changed for me, but because I changed to reach you." It was simple and transformative, because for the first time, being there wasn't a favor. It was a right I'd earned. And this time, no one told me to get up. On the contrary, they made room, and I stayed. I sat, I ate, I laughed. It was me, and my father, by my side, without needing to say anything else, because now even the silence between us was comfortable. And when respect is real, it doesn't need to be shouted. It's simply felt. A few days later, on a normal afternoon, he sent me a short message. "Come by." I arrived to find him sitting on the porch, staring up at the sky. 2 mugs of coffee sat beside him. I sat down. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said, "Did you know your name means man of courage?" I nodded. "Yes, and now I understand why." He paused. Then he said, "You had the courage to continue even without support, to love me even when I didn't know how to love you." His voice cracked, but he continued, "And for all of this, thank you for being my son, not just by blood, but by presence, truly, by soul." And then I cried, for the child in me that always wanted to hear that. He called me son like never before, with affection, with admiration, and not as an obligation. It was recognition. It was love without strings attached. And in that moment, all the years of pain seemed to serve a purpose, because when someone chooses to see you, everything changes. The story changes. The relationship is reborn. We said goodbye with a long hug, a deep one, full of things that were never said. And I left feeling light, because I understood that sometimes the greatest victory isn't changing the other person. It's being consistent enough that when they're ready, they know you're still there. No resentment, no pressure, just presence. And if you've made it this far with me, I tell you, don't give up trying. Not out of pride, but because truly loving is also being willing to start over, even if the pain tells you not to try anymore. Because what can come from this effort? Sometimes it's a story worth every scar. Not every new beginning begins with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with listening, with a willingness to see the other person not as they were, but as they are trying to be. My father and I don't erase the past. It still lives within us, but today, it no longer screams. It only remembers that we had the courage to rewrite it together. It took years for this moment to happen. Years of cursed silences, harsh words, and swallowed hurt. But every step toward understanding was worth it, because I learned that even the people who hurt you the most can also be the ones who need you the most. And that changes everything. My father was never much of a talker. But that day, when he called me son with a choked voice, it was as if the entire weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, and mine, because finally he saw me, and more importantly, he chose me, again, not as he should have in the beginning, but as he could now. If you're experiencing something similar, don't keep this pain bottled up forever. Talk about it, face it, protect yourself, yes, but when there's room, try, even if just once. Sometimes, it's in that attempt that change lies. Because relationships aren't about perfection, they're about presence, and presence changes everything. If this story touched you, share this right now with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to the family group, on WhatsApp, on Instagram Direct. You never know who needs a silent reconciliation. Comment below where you are watching from and if any part of this story touched you. I read everything and respond whenever I can. I want to get to know you too. It is clear. Subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell, because here we tell stories that heal, transform, and inspire. See you in the next video. And never forget, there's always time to come back, if there's still someone waiting with open arms.